to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I'm zooming in for, who are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, but that violent genocide was carried out against their people. I would also like to particularly acknowledge, in relation to running a philosophy event, how the effects of colonization and the white possessive have dominated Indigenous knowledges and way of knowing, and that part of the project in philosophy is that we must work to try and reject that colonization of ways of knowing, because it is one of the more insidious forms of colonization that is often missed. So, to begin my talk, I'd like to tell a brief story about how I came across this issue in the beginning. So my consent education at school was reasonably minimal. And the most memorable element was that one day in the library we were shown the T video, which I'll come back to later. After watching the video in year 10, I felt like I had a reasonably solid grasp of consent, but it wasn't until I went along to Laura Desmond's one-woman play called Socially Unacceptable, which was part of the Fringe Festival in year 12, that I really got a handle on what consent actually meant and how it worked. One of Desmond's lines that struck me the most was when she said, in relation to a story of being sexually assaulted, "I didn't say no, but I sure as fuck didn't say yes." At the time, I think I knew, at least intellectually, that silence didn't equal consent. But after Desmond's performance, I think I gained something like a knowledge by acquaintance of consent, where I previously had only had knowledge that. So I gained a new form of understanding of consent through that play that I just hadn't been provided through my high school education. And I think that I was definitely worse off because I hadn't been provided with that kind of education. So speaking of the T video, and I think potentially the updated version, which bizarrely is also beverage themed, was the milkshake video. Having one beverage-based British voice-overed dodgy education video about consent seems like an accident, but two of them just seems to be reckless. So the T video begins by saying, if you're struggling with consent, so if you're struggling with the idea of how to engage in interpersonal sexual relations, the answer is just a cup of tea. The video stresses points like unconscious people don't want tea. And it also has this line where it says, if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, then you're able to understand when they don't want tea, then how hard is it when it comes to sex? So I'm going to get further into exactly what's going wrong here later on, but I just wanted to start with this because these are the claims that the T video makes. These are like exact quotes from it. And this is what we're being taught. Like, this is the way we're being taught to understand consent. So I think that the data is going to be incredibly important to figuring out what actually we need to be teaching people instead. The milkshake video, in a similar way, seems to make this equation about like getting pizza versus touching your butt as preferences that you can have, and thinks that the difference in the strength of the preference is what, that's all that's making it different. So thinking about, especially the line, the completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, I want to contrast that with something that Bree Lee, who's an author and advocate, says when she speaks to high school students about consent. Bree Lee asks students, why do you want to be having sex with someone who doesn't want to be having sex with you? Why do you want to be having sex with someone who doesn't want to be having sex with you? And I want to think about that in comparison with how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea. I think one of these statements is clear and the other one is needlessly complicated with analogy. One of the statements makes people reflect about their own lives and choices, and the other deals in abstractions. And one of the statements actually helps people understand the normative uncomfortableness of non-consent, whereas the other one trivializes the issue. So triviality is something I'm going to come back to later. The first part I'm going to deal with is the idea that the tea video and the milkshake video just make sense. Like, in the broadest sense, I'm going to argue that they don't make sense, that it is in fact something different when we have sexual consent than when we have ordinary bodily consent that we would have to, say, drink tea. So the two elements that we're getting, so to begin with, the idea that we need to have consent stems from the idea that we have autonomy. So I think that there are two kinds of autonomy. One of them is going to be bodily autonomy and one of them is going to be sexual autonomy. So bodily autonomy is going to be something along the lines of, we have the right to decide what kind of things happen to our body, and it's going to have a reciprocal duty for people to not do things to us, people to not do things to our body which isn't what we want to have done to it. And then we're going to have sexual autonomy. And sexual autonomy is that we have the right to decide what kind of sexual things we engage in, and the reciprocal duty is going to be not to engage us in sexual activities that we don't want to engage in. So we have these two kinds of ideas, and we think that they flow together reasonably well. But I think that it's incorrect if we just conflate them and say that sexual autonomy is merely a specific kind of bodily autonomy that deals with like sexual parts of the body or sexual acts. And my justification for that, at least intuitively, comes from a thought experiment. There's a very famous thought experiment in consent philosophy that deals with the debate between harm-based theorists and rights-based theorists as to the wrong of rape. So the harm-based theorists say that something is wrong if it causes harm, and the rights-based theorists say that something is wrong if it violates a right. And the rights-based theorists presented this thought experiment. They said, imagine a person who was in a comatose state and someone went and sexually violated that person in a comatose state, and the person in the comatose state would never be able to realize what happened to them, and there could be no harm to them because they would never have any psychological or physical realization of what had happened. And the harm-based theorists say that that's still wrong, right? It's wrong to violate someone even if there's no harm caused to them. And on that point, in the discourse, they won. And I think it makes sense why they won. It still seems that even if a person's in a comatose state, it's still wrong to sexually violate them. I think that's quite an uncontroversial claim, and a compelling intuition that we should definitely agree with. And I take that thought experiment and I expand it to show the difference between bodily autonomy and sexual autonomy, because I consider two different cases of maybe potentially the same patient, but at least two comatose cases where there's no harm. And if we think about one would be an ordinary bodily autonomy violation. So if you touch someone in a non-sexual way, or you cut their hair, or you drew on them. And in the other case was some kind of sexual violation. And I think that intuitively, we say that the sexual violation is worse. It's more seriously wrong to sexually violate the person, even if it doesn't cause any harm to them, than it is to merely violate their bodily autonomy, their ordinary bodily autonomy. And the reason I think that that's an important thought experiment is because normally when we think about sex crimes, we think about them being worse than ordinary body crimes for the reason that they cause more harm. So the rights theorists certainly agree that you can have harm as an aggregating factor. A breach of a right with serious harm is going to be worse than just a breach of a right. But in this case, where there's no harm as an aggregating factor, it seems that the breach of sexual autonomy is still worse than the breach of bodily autonomy without harm as an aggregating factor. And because these two things have different moral value, I think that means that they have to come from a different justification. So there has to be a different right operating to allow for the different moral value to occur. I think something additionally that it's not as strong, but still worth considering, is the idea of necessity, and that necessity can be a reason to violate bodily autonomy if someone needs to perform emergency surgery, for example, and there was no capacity of the person to consent. But that simply doesn't apply in the case of sexual autonomy. There could be no case where it was necessary for someone's sexual autonomy to be violated. I think that that speaks to, or is a shadow of, the fact that they are different kinds of autonomy. So with the different kinds of autonomy, I think it follows from that we need to have different kinds of consent in order to deal with that correctly. And the different kind, I think in the case of sexual autonomy and sexual consent, that is the reciprocal of it. Something we need to focus on is allowing and the inappropriateness of allowing, or to be confusing, allowing. And this comes quite neatly packaged in a quote from Catherine McKinnon in Towards a Feminist Theory of a State, where McKinnon says, "If sex is normally something that men do to women, the issue is less whether there is force than whether consent is a meaningful concept." So in McKinnon's chapter where she says this, she, talks about ideas of force back when the debate was between like force versus consent. But this line about if sex is something that men do to women, what does it mean to have consent? And what that points to, and what I would do with that in arguing for a new version of sexual consent, is to say that it's about, we need to have a transformative relationship created with consent, which isn't just transforming an action from impermissible to permissible. It needs to actually transform the relation between the actors such that it's no longer somebody doing something to someone, and instead it's somebody doing something with someone. Changing the to a with, I think, is really important in the way that we can understand consent and the kinds of things that we want to be able to exclude and be able to point out as wrong from the kinds of things that we don't think are wrong and we don't need to be pointing out as wrong. So particularly allowing, and the reason that I'm so concerned with allowing is because it's something that I think often people don't see as being wrong because there's this idea that it was consensual. That if you said yes eventually, or, you said yes because it was easier without serious duress, because in serious duress cases, I think it's very clear that it's non-consent. But in that kind of giving in and allowing are still cases that are going to generate serious wrong, right? They're going to be harmful and they're going to violate people's autonomy in the way that we don't really think about that with ordinary bodily autonomy. For example, if a doctor had to sort of convince you into agreeing to a surgery or agreeing to a medical procedure that you at first didn't agree to, but they laid out the facts and they showed that it was in your interest, not in a manipulating way. I think we can conceive of an example that isn't in a manipulating or malevolent way. I think that kind of an example exists where in the sexual case it doesn't. Someone convincing you into sex and then you allowing them to do something sexual to you is going to be very different to in the medical case where you're allowing a doctor to do something to you in a medical procedure. So that's the first issue. And I hopefully have shown, or at least spoken to, the importance of thinking about the difference between bodily autonomy and sexual autonomy. The reasons that is important is because I'm going to pick it up largely in the second part too. So the second part, I'm concerned about epistemic injustice, and in particular, hermeneutical injustice. Hermeneutical injustice is going to be along the lines of not providing the tools or the concepts for people to understand their own experiences of the world. So a very famous example of this is taken from the creation of the term sexual harassment, which was a concept tool that women were able to use to understand their experiences in the workplace of being sexually harassed. Before there was the word sexual harassment, it was very difficult, or activists found it very difficult to organize around this problem and get legislative action. But after the term was introduced, it became much easier for people to realize what was done to them was wrong. And that idea about realizing that what was done to them was wrong is very clear in cases of consent, especially in relation to what I'm calling, and what I think Bree Lee coined, which is the idea of the Kontos epiphany. So named after Chantal Kontos, who is an activist who started a petition which generated thousands of testimonials from schoolgirls in Sydney about sexual violations that have been done to them. Many of them had this part where they learned about consent, in year 10, year 11, in year 12, and they realized that something that had been done to them had been sexual assault or worse. And when they got this idea of consent, they suddenly had that realization, and they were provided with the concept, and then they were able to understand their experiences of the world. So that's the hermeneutical justice. I think that there's two important parts in relation to how we teach about sexual consent. And we get up to the top with the videos, which are how we actually teach about sexual consent. So the first one is that we teach sexual consent as being the same as bodily consent. That consent with T is the same as consent with sex. I think that that's wrong for the reasons I outlined earlier. And I think that that wrong also carries a hermeneutical layer because we deny people the ability to understand the seriousness, or we invalidate the seriousness of what was done to them because we see it as just being the same, or, just a little bit more of a preference-based thing than the T. But we also know from Chantal Contos's testimonies that she gathered that the people who are hearing this, the people who are receiving these lessons, have at increasing or very considerable numbers firsthand experience with consent violations. And so reducing it just to being the same as getting consent for giving tea seems to be something very different. It seems to be minimizing the significance of what was going on, both in the initial fact of actually using tea and at the second level of saying that sexual autonomy is the same as bodily autonomy. So those are my two main concerns. They're directed primarily at the tea videos, but also at the common sense understanding of consent and the way that it's taught in general. And thank you. That's what I've got.
Thank you, Sam. That was a very good talk. I'm going to stop the recording now and we can have a bit of a discussion.